January 16th, 2009. Harare, Zimbabwe. The central bank issues a new banknote. Its face value? $100 trillion. By the time it reached store shelves, it was barely enough to buy a loaf of bread, if any bread was left on the shelves at all. Zimbabwe had not always been an economic disaster. The country, formerly the British colony of Rhodesia, gained independence in 1980 after a long guerrilla war, with Robert Mugabe becoming its first prime minister and later its president. For its first decade under majority rule, the country was widely called the breadbasket of Southern Africa, exporting tobacco, maize, and beef across the region on the strength of a large commercial farming sector. The economy grew steadily through the 1980s, and the Zimbabwean dollar traded roughly on par with the US dollar. The trouble built slowly, then all at once. In 1997, facing pressure from veterans of the country's independence war, who had grown frustrated at being left out of the country's post-war prosperity, Mugabe's government approved large, unbudgeted cash payouts to tens of thousands of former fighters, a bill the Treasury had not planned for and could not easily cover. The announcement triggered a currency crash so severe that the day became known locally as Black Friday. The Zimbabwean dollar lost about 3/4 of its value against the US dollar in a single trading session, and the stock market crashed alongside it. The following year, Zimbabwe sent thousands of troops into the war in the neighboring Democratic Republic of Congo, backing the government there against several rebel factions. A costly military intervention that drained the treasury further, with little clear benefit at home, beyond access to mining concessions that mostly enriched a small circle of officials. Government spending kept climbing, and rather than raise taxes or borrow abroad, where lenders were increasingly wary of Zimbabwe's finances, the government leaned on its central bank to print more money to cover the gap. Then, starting in 2000, facing growing political opposition and a tightly contested election that had shaken his party's confidence, Zimbabwe under Mugabe launched a sweeping land reform program, seizing thousands of commercial farms owned by white Zimbabweans, often violently, and led in the early stages by groups of self-described war veterans who occupied farms and, in some documented cases, killed farmers who resisted. Roughly 4,000 large commercial farms existed before the program began. Within a few years, the vast majority had changed hands. Some land went to genuinely landless Zimbabweans, but much of it went to Mugabe loyalists, senior officials, and military officers with little farming experience and none of the capital or equipment needed to run large commercial operations. Agricultural output, the backbone of Zimbabwe's export economy, collapsed within a few years, and the country that had once fed much of the region began struggling to feed itself. Foreign currency earnings dried up, just as government spending kept rising, and Western governments, citing the violence and human rights abuses tied to the land seizures, imposed sanctions and cut off much of the aid and investment Zimbabwe had previously relied on. With tax revenue and exports both shrinking, the government's only remaining option to pay its bills was to print more Zimbabwean dollars. That is exactly what it did, repeatedly, for years, under central bank governor Gideon Gono, who openly defended the policy as a necessary tool to keep the state and struggling businesses afloat, later writing that he saw himself as an economic soldier fighting on multiple fronts at once. Beyond simply printing currency to cover the budget, Gono's central bank also directly funded fuel imports, farming equipment, and subsidized loans to favored businesses and individuals, activities well outside a central bank's normal role that economists later labeled quasi-fiscal operations, effectively hiding a second, unaccountable layer of government spending inside the bank's own balance sheet. Printing money without anything backing its value did not create wealth. It simply meant more currency chasing the same shrinking pool of goods, and prices began rising to compensate. By 2001, Zimbabwe's annual inflation rate had passed 100%, a threshold economists often use as a marker of a currency in real trouble. The government responded to rising prices not by slowing the printing presses, but by imposing price controls, ordering shopkeepers to sell goods below what it now cost to produce or import them. Shelves emptied almost immediately, since nobody could afford to sell at a loss, and a black market selling the same goods at real prices sprang up alongside the official empty stores, often run informally out of the very shops that had just been emptied by the controls. By the middle of the decade, the numbers had become almost impossible to track. Inflation, measured in the tens of thousands of percent annually by 2006 and 2007, forced the government to redenominate the currency 3 separate times over those years, slashing zeros off the banknotes each time, simply to keep the numbers on the bills manageable. In 2007, as prices kept climbing, the government also launched a nationwide crackdown, ordering businesses to cut prices by half or more overnight, sending police and party militias into shops to enforce the new, unpayable prices. Business owners who refused, or who simply could not sell goods at a loss without going bankrupt, were arrested by the hundreds, and shelves that had already been thin emptied out almost completely within days, as retailers pulled stock rather than sell at government-mandated prices below cost. Neither the redenominations nor the price crackdown addressed the actual cause. The money supply kept expanding to cover a budget the government could not otherwise fund. By 2008, Zimbabwe's hyperinflation had become one of the worst ever recorded anywhere in the world, in the same historical company as Weimar Germany in the 1920s and Hungary just after the Second World War. The government's own statistics agency stopped being able to reliably calculate an official rate and eventually gave up publishing figures altogether. But independent economists, most notably Steve Hanke at the Cato Institute, calculated that at its peak in mid-November 2008, prices were doubling roughly every 25 hours, implying a monthly inflation rate above 79 billion %. Zimbabweans paid for basic groceries with stacks and eventually wheelbarrows of cash. Shop prices sometimes changed multiple times in a single day, with staff walking the aisles, updating tags by hand. Workers were paid and rushed immediately to spend their wages before the money lost meaningful value by the following morning. Banks limited how much cash customers could withdraw each day, so even people with money in their accounts often could not get enough of it out fast enough to keep ahead of the price increases, and long queues formed outside banks before dawn. That same year, the country's political crisis deepened alongside its economic one. A disputed presidential election in 2008, marked by widespread violence against the opposition and international observers who called it neither free nor fair, further isolated Zimbabwe internationally and deepened the sense that the country's institutions, not just its currency, were breaking down. The central bank kept issuing larger denominations to keep pace. A $1,000 note in the early 2000s gave way to a $1 million note by 2007, then 10 million, then 100 million, and a billion by mid-2008, and eventually notes measured in the trillions. In January 2009, it issued the $100 trillion note that briefly became a symbol of the crisis worldwide, reproduced in newspapers, and later sold to tourists and collectors as a novelty, worth more as a souvenir than it had ever been as functioning currency. At the peak, the entire denomination series had become almost comedic. A $100 trillion note, printed with more zeros than most people would ever see on a single piece of paper, was worth only a few US dollars and shrinking by the hour. Ordinary life became a constant improvisation. Pensions and life savings held in Zimbabwean dollars were wiped out almost entirely, since the value of any fixed sum collapsed within weeks or days. Retirement funds that had once been enough to buy a house were, by 2008, not reliably enough to buy a loaf of bread. Businesses that could switched to pricing goods in US dollars or South African rand. And by early 2009, that informal practice had become official policy, with the government formally recognizing a basket of foreign currencies, including the US dollar, the South African rand, the Botswana pula, and the British pound, as legal tender alongside a Zimbabwean dollar that almost nobody wanted anymore. The government suspended the Zimbabwean dollar entirely in April 2009, allowing foreign currencies to be used freely for everyday transactions, a de facto admission that the currency it had printed into worthlessness could no longer function as money at all. Over the course of the crisis, millions of Zimbabweans, by some estimates as much as a quarter of the population, left the country in search of work, mostly to South Africa and the United Kingdom, one of the largest peacetime emigrations in the region's modern history. Zimbabwe would spend the next decade and a half trying to rebuild lasting trust in a national currency, with mixed and often short-lived success. A stopgap called bond notes appeared in 2016, officially pegged 1-to-1 with the US dollar, but quickly trading for far less on the informal street market, followed by a reintroduced Zimbabwean dollar in 2019 that quickly began losing value again, as the same habits of unfunded government spending resurfaced, pushing inflation back above 500% by 2020, and prompting yet another currency crisis in 2022 and 2023. In 2024, the government tried once more, launching a new currency called the ZIG, short for Zimbabwe Gold, this time nominally backed by gold and foreign currency reserves held by the central bank. An attempt to convince a population that had watched its money become worthless multiple times before that this version might finally hold its value. The $100 trillion note still trades online today, worth a few US dollars as a collector's curiosity, a small paper monument to a government that printed its way into ruin. It is worth more now than it ever was as money.